Good morning. I think I'd like to ask my speakers to turn on their videos if possible, so that we start in a moment. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, our attendees joining us from all around the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome. It is such a huge pleasure and privilege to be with you on this Friday to welcome you to this timely discussion on global and regional trade negotiations on e-commerce. My name is Maggie Omotesi. I'm an international journalist and media entrepreneur, and I'll be guiding you through the discussion for the next few hours. I'm joining in live from Senegal in Dakar, and I'm so excited to be with all of you today. I'll just put down a few house rules to guide us as we move with the discussion. This event is broadcasted live and is also streaming on UNCTAD's Facebook page. And the session will be interpreted simultaneously in 3 different UN languages: Spanish, French, and English. Just go below the Zoom link and choose a language of your choice. But also for those in the room, we will be taking some questions later on. But if you're joining us online, just like myself, use the Q&A box provided under the Zoom link, and we'll read out. If time allows, we'll send in your questions. If the time doesn't, we will still get the engagement ongoing on our digital platforms. Just follow UNCTAD anywhere, Twitter and Facebook, and maybe engage the speakers directly if you may. I also have to say, please, if you're not speaking, try to mute and do not unmute if you're not speaking. So it's the other way around. If you're speaking, unmute. If you're not speaking, do not unmute. And I hope we have a lovely conversation. As we all know, the coronavirus pandemic has in every way disrupted lives, from the most basic things like a handshake, how we eat or even interact, but also most importantly, it has transformed the way we produce, consume, and do business. But in this moment of disruption, there has been an opportunity with several discussions ongoing, and one that has lighted the need of e-commerce and accelerated digitalization by 7 years globally. This is according to a report by McKinsey. Now, let's think of this discussion as a real-time exploration of an understanding of why we need negotiations on e-commerce and what is at stake. My hope and the team's hope at UNCTAD is that our panelists and experts will help us examine how these negotiations could be leveraged to build the digital capacities of developing countries in a way to narrow existing digital and data divide. But let's not forget that at the core of every discussion that we will have today also lies sustainable development. I am super excited to introduce to you our esteemed speakers, men and women of great thought leaders in their respective fields. And again, if you are all in the same room today, I would ask you to clap warmly and make them feel welcome and thank them for joining us. But please do that from wherever you're joining from. Welcome to our speakers and panelists today. In Geneva, we are joined by Ms. Isabel Durand, who is the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, an advocate for gender equality. She has relentlessly contributed to making international trade more inclusive and greener. A former Vice Prime Minister and Senator of Belgium, as well as Vice President of the European Parliament, Ms. Durand possesses solid experience in public affairs, intergovernmental processes, and providing concrete assistance to countries. We will also have a message from Ms. Maria Francesca Spatolizano, the United Nations Secretary General's Acting Envoy on Technology, with over 30 years of experience in public service, including extensive senior leadership in multilateral affairs. She has served as the European Union ambassador to the OECD and UNESCO, Monaco, and Andorra. She was a member of the EU delegation to the United Nations, also serving as the head of its economic and trade section, covering all issues related to trade, development, and environmental policies in the second committee. We will also have remarks from His Excellency Mr. Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the AfCFTA Secretariat. He served as Chief Director of the Africa Economic Relations at the Department of Trade and Industry of South Africa. In this role, he was South Africa's Chief Trade Negotiator in the AfCFTA and tripartite FTA negotiations. During this time as Chief Negotiator, South Africa ratified both the AfCFTA and tripartite FTA agreements. We also have with us online already His Excellency Mr. Tan Hussein, who is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Singapore to the World Trade Organization and World Intellectual Property Organization. Prior to this, he served as Singapore's Ambassador to the Arab Republic of Egypt with concurrent accreditation to Libya. He was also concurrently accredited to the state of Kuwait until October 2012. We will also have Ms. Miho Shrotori joining us live in Geneva. She is the acting director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD. As the head of the Trading Systems, Services and Creative Economy branch, Miho leads a team that assesses contributions of trade agreements, the services sector development, and the creative industries to inclusive and sustainable economic diversification. I personally can't wait to hear from her. Miss Emily Mburu-Ndoria is also joining us live in Geneva. She is the Director of the Trade Services, Investment, Intellectual Property Rights and Digital Trade, AfCFTA Secretariat. She was formerly the head of Trade and Services Department at the East African Community ESC Secretariat, where she worked extensively as an independent consultant, providing expertise in the area of trade and services in Eastern and South African region through the provision of analytical and training services. And last but not last, we have Mr. Pradeep Mehta. He's the founder and Secretary General of the CAS International, a leading economic policy research, advocacy, and networking non-governmental group of India, with offices in Nairobi, Lusaka, Hanoi, Accra, Geneva, and Washington, DC. Now, CATS was also established in 1983 and completed 35 glorious years. I want to say a huge welcome to our speakers and thank you for being with us today. Maybe we can turn on our videos a little bit for the audience to see us. And good morning once again and welcome. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite UNCTAD's Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Isabel Durand, our host today, to also give us the opening remarks. Ma'am, you have the floor. Unmute. Yeah.
It's okay, it works. You hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. I think you might need to unmute, unmute, yes.
Good. So thank you, Maggie. And I'm not precisely in Geneva today, but that's the asset of this fantastic and amazing week and hybrid issue. I can speak and follow this last day of this e-commerce week from Brussels. So je vais faire ma petite introduction en français.
To make a brief introduction in French. So I would ask you all to interpretation on this. Now, numerous aspects of e-commerce have already been discussed and debated over the course of this week, but this particular session is going to focus on an aspect which I believe is something that requires specific attention, namely commercial negotiations on e-commerce and the way in which they can be made available to development. We know that more than a quarter of the preferential commercial agreements at WTO, including the bilateral commercial agreements, already included in 2017 a specific reference to e-commerce and a provision to it. But with commerce going up and digital data as well, and the widening of the digital gap, many questions and problems have to be taken care of to promote this. The regulatory environment is very unequal at this time, and many countries still have to develop their own national regulatory framework on e-commerce or on data flows. For them, the crucial question is to try to determine whether the regulations and the agreements which are being discussed will be able to reinforce their capacity to use the value of e-commerce. Now, we must acknowledge this. It's not easy to negotiate and to agree on rules about e-commerce with developed partners where they are using these much more, given the fact that there are all sorts of gaps in terms of connectivity, for example, of competence, and in spite of a general environment which is quite favorable. The really crucial question is to try to determine what has to be done outside this process in order to guarantee that the new rules which are going to emerge can actually serve the interests of the greatest number and in an equitable way. All the more so since during this intermediate period, countries are attempting to sign new agreements that actually circumvent existing rules on the commerce of goods and services. Now, the governance of data and transporter data flows is very complex. In fact, it's complex because our report in 2021 called for a reframing of this debate. First of all, we know that there is no universally recognized or acknowledged understanding of what the concept of data is. Number two, the transborder data flows are very difficult to measure. There are no official statistics that are reliable enough to be able to clarify efforts in terms of regulation, in terms of type, value, and places of exchanges, because there is no information, no statistics. In addition, the transborder data flows are in and of themselves not actually, strictly speaking, e-commerce, nor do they represent actual commerce, and some of them should not, in fact, not be regulated as such. The data do not have a strictly commercial value, but they can have, they're multidimensional. They can have a social value for the environment, for the economy as a whole. Therefore, we cannot leave it up to the markets alone, especially as regards social data. Thirdly, the distribution of the income from the gains from private income is also extremely unequal, and it's very difficult to reconcile national sovereignty associated with the territories of the countries and the outside or no border nature, globality, and the opening of the digital space where these data actually move. This is why the new regulations that will be adopted will have to take into account all of these dimensions of the data, both the financial and non-financial data. Different policies, political, have already been implemented, such as restrictions on the transporter data flow and requirements for the localization of data. However, neither the total freedom of the flow of data is able to satisfy the needs of countries that have to reach certain specific development goals. And as I said, commercial negotiations concentrate naturally on the financial nature of data, but there is another component, which is a non-financial data. The new regulations, therefore, have to go beyond, above and beyond trade or commerce, and have to tackle this in a more holistic manner. This means that we have to take into account all sorts of implications for human rights, for national security, for trade, for competition, for tax purposes, and also the global governance of the internet. Now, who is in the best position to discuss this? Well, it is the United Nations, of course. The United Nations is the most appropriate international forum to carry out world-level debates on the governance of data and the transporter data flows. Support must be given, especially, and UNCTAD is here, of course, as well, to try to support the negotiators in their ability and capacity to generate these transporter data flows. And it involves a number of things. First of all, the awareness of issues associated with data and their incidence on development, as well as an effective participation of developing countries to the world dialogues, world level dialogues, and regional dialogues, because these places are not only places where one becomes familiar with the situation, these are actually places where negotiations are carried out and where we negotiate things that are going to have an impact, a huge impact for everyone. So it's very important that the points of view of developing countries and their interests must be taken into account and must be heard. The second element is the formulation of legal frameworks and regulatory frameworks that are relevant at the national level. For example, we know today that more than 1/2 of SMEs have put into place, sorry, correction, says the speaker, fewer than 50% of SMEs have put in place legislation on the protection of data and private life. So there is, so many of these still need to do this. The third type of support is the development of national strategies to manage the data and the flows of transborder data, so that this resource can contribute to the to economic development. It would in fact be extremely useful and most appropriate if any future rule adopted in the future in terms of e-commerce should include mobilization of resources for the financial and technical assistance of developing countries in this area. Otherwise, the rules, the implementation of the rules will be unequal, will remain unequal. If all of these different aspects are not actually covered, we know that the digital divide, or rather digital divides in the plural, the one based on data, will will accentuate the inequalities of development and will endanger the process of the SDGs and will make the course of history, the economic history, more uncertain. And that's a very good reason for us to stress everything that needs to be done in our discussion here if we wish to have the proper frame for the discussion of e-commerce and data flows. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Isabel Dura. Thank you so much for your remarks. And obviously, as we heard from you, there's need to ensure that emerging rules will serve the interests of all players in an equitable manner, but also very much so to note the data flows and mobilization of resources needed, especially for developing countries. Thanks a lot for your remarks, ma'am. Now, of course, as we aim also to frame our discussion of trade negotiations from a broader UN development perspective, it is very important to learn how the United Nations is approaching to the global digital cooperation. And obviously, speaking further on this subject, we have a message from the UN Secretary General's Acting Envoy on Technology, Ms. Maria Francesca Spartolizano, who was not able to join us live, but take a listen to her message.
Ms. Rebecca Greenspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to participate in this high-level session of e-commerce week on global and regional trade negotiations on e-commerce. In many ways, the COVID pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation over the past 2 years. As authorities closed the physical businesses to contain the spread of the virus, consumers placed orders online and businesses adapted their services accordingly. For some, COVID has even presented new commercial opportunities online. However, unfortunately, not all have been able to connect to the internet or to trade online and to participate in the wealth creation. Real digital divides exist, and the unconnected and digital have-nots are falling further behind, not just in trade and economic opportunities, but also in education and social participation. 2 years ago, Secretary General Guterres launched his roadmap for digital cooperation. Issued in the midst of the pandemic, the report outlines the Secretary General's vision for international collaboration on digital technologies. First and foremost, it urges universal connectivity, which is a prerequisite for online commerce. the 2.9 billion people that still remain offline do not have access to the transformative potential of digital technologies and indeed the possible benefits of the digital economy. The roadmap also presents recommendations to strengthen digital capacities, promote digital public goods and digital trust and security, and provide a more effective overall architecture for digital cooperation. By cooperating in these areas, we can improve the conditions for e-commerce to flourish in a safe and fair environment. As we look ahead to COVID recovery and building back better, we have an opportunity to evaluate regulatory and other hurdles to online trade in goods and services. Negotiations can consider how to ensure trade is fair, including how transactions and revenues are taxed, and how to contribute to building digital capacities. Efforts are required not just at the international level, but also at regional, national, and subnational levels. Indeed, regional trade agreements are one means of addressing trade obstacles and narrowing gaps in readiness for e-commerce. My office looks forward to hearing about the best practices and the constraints developing countries face in e-commerce, as identified in your discussions this week. Ladies and gentlemen, building on the roadmap, in September 2021, the Secretary General presented his report entitled Our Common Agenda, which lays out his vision of the future of multilateralism and also identifies key issues that the international community must address. In particular, his report suggests the potential for a digital development tax or similar tax reforms by considering how major technology companies can contribute to narrowing digital divides. This is an area where your work, supported by UNCTAD's broader efforts, might find some resonance. Everybody will benefit from a well-documented study on possible scenarios in the area of digital taxation. In addition, as requested by the Secretary General, my office has started informal preparatory work on the digital-related elements in the common agenda. In particular, the proposal for a global digital compact, working closely with other key UN agencies. This compact is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to bring governments, the private sector, and civil society together to forge a new understanding on key principles for our digital age and build an open, free, and secure digital future for all. As we prepare for the Summit of the Future in September 2023, we look to the international community to provide important inputs on the substantive issues in the Global Digital Compact. This includes through relevant outcomes that arise from this e-commerce week and many other established UN processes. I look forward to your input and our continued collaboration. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that message. Of course, it's very clear from the message, the potential for a digital development tax or similar tax reforms by considering how major technology companies can contribute to narrowing digital divides. For me, it poses a question around, what is done in cases of countries, for example, in Africa, where a lot of e-commerce is actually done on social media pages, Instagram. You want to buy something, so quick on your Facebook page. So many questions to answer. But obviously, there's nowhere in the world is the case for digital capacity than here in Africa, as the continent embarks on regulation and harmonization of e-commerce in the context of the AFCFTA. And of course, His Excellency, Mr. Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General for AFCFTA Secretariat, shares his vision on digital trade under the AFCFTA. Take a listen.
Secretary General Greenspan, honorable ministers, Your Excellencies, representatives, permanent representatives to the UN, ambassadors, senior officials in the room. It's a pleasure to join you virtually on this very important week on e-commerce week, which will reflect, I hope, and offer solutions to the challenges that we confront in the area of digital trade and digital economies development. It's unfortunate that I'm not able to join you in person. I would have wanted to be there, but I have colleagues on the ground who have been in attendance this entire week, and I know that they are participating on behalf of the AFCFTA Secretariat very, very effectively. You may be aware that the AFCFTA has a number of protocols. One of the protocols is on digital trade, and this protocol is being negotiated at a time when digital trade and e-commerce have really come to the fore of the global economy, pushed to the fore by the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a very unique opportunity in Africa as we negotiate the AFCFTA protocol on digital trade. And the reason we have a unique opportunity is because we can leapfrog into the fourth industrial revolution using digital trade as a very, very strong motive force to advance Africa's development. And so the digital trade protocol that we have started negotiating will be comprehensive. It will cover issues such as payments, digital payments. It will cover market access. And of course, it will cover very important areas such as data flows and movement of data, transfers of data across regions of the African continent. Probably the most important aspect of the digital trade protocol that we are negotiating is how the protocol will address challenges of inclusion and how the protocol will reflect Africa's development objectives. We know from recent experiences over the last 2 years confronting the pandemic that digital trade and e-commerce are actually very, very important drivers of development and are also equally important for the purposes of inclusion. And so the protocol on digital trade of the AFCFTA will have to explore and will have to ensure that it codifies into legally binding language, codifies these development and inclusivity objectives that I speak to. For example, how do we make sure that small, medium enterprises that are active already in digital trade and e-commerce in Africa, how do we make sure that these small, medium enterprises continue to use digital trade as a tool to advance to new markets, as a tool to access new businesses, and of course, how do we make sure that digital trade and the opportunities that it provides addresses inclusion of young entrepreneurs to bring them into the fold of the formal economy. These are very important tools for development, and I would suggest that without COVID-19, we probably would not be thinking so innovatively about digital trade and digital tools in terms of inclusion, economic activity, and reaching new markets that are not immediately in proximity to where a small, medium enterprises may be, or to where a young entrepreneur may be. And so the lawyers will help us to codify these aspirations of inclusion and development, to codify these aspirations into legally binding obligations in a protocol that will have a high ambition from a market access point of view, that will have the wide scope that is required to address all of the challenges that are related to the various aspects of digital trade that I've mentioned, such as data flows, data management centers, and of course, market access. The last observation I would make on the importance of digital tools, particularly in a context of developing countries, is how we now have a unique opportunity to deploy these digital tools to ensure that we have truly harmonized customs procedures. There again, as the African continent under the AfCFTA, we have started working on this. We have started thinking about it in terms of how we can deploy digital tools to advance trade across borders on the basis of what we now have, a system, a harmonized system of customs procedures, transit of goods, and trade facilitation. And so I look forward to working with UNCTAD and our partners around the world to make sure that we have a protocol that is truly reflective of Africa's development objectives, as well as truly reflective of Africa's inclusivity objectives. I wish you very, very good deliberations for the rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Was the message from His Excellency, Mr. Wamkelemene. Excellency, thank you, Ms. Isabel Duran and Ms. Maria Francesca Spotolizano. Thank you. As you have laid out your thoughts fully on the importance of these negotiations, I think one thing that has come through has been how we lead address Africa's development objectives, but also other developing nations. Obviously, major developments are taking place in regional and global context in digital trade, rulemaking, including focusing on cross-border data flows. But this is not easy for many developing countries, especially because they're just beginning to develop their own national regulatory frameworks to govern the sector that has not yet fully evolved. And this brings us to our panel discussion, which I'm super excited about, to help us understand, but also dig deeper into understanding the implications. Like I said earlier on, at the heart of this also lies a sustainable development. I want to bring in Ms. Miho Shiratori from UNCTAD. We've had from the opening remarks of speakers, one of the things that has come out very strongly has been cross-border data flows. They've talked about taxation, the opportunity, the risk for governments, but also, especially for Mr. Wamkele, he asks, how would this address inclusion, but also how does this align with our development objectives at the AfCFTA? Obviously, all of these need to be addressed. There's, bits and bits of this. The question is, where do we start when it comes to common e-commerce regulatory frameworks? Ms. Miho?
Secretary General was supposed to be here, but since she has another engagement, allow me to stand in. Thank you very much, Maggie, for the question. Let me just frame it in a two-way of the question. First of all, about the readiness to participate in the debate of the digitalization and the e-commerce negotiations from the perspective of the data, and also from what could be the key considerations that need to be addressed in common e-commerce regulatory frameworks. First of all, what do we know about the readiness of developing countries in participating in e-commerce? Well, this is already a very clear, there's a clear answer for that, because the UNCTAD e-trade readiness assessment of 29 countries identified 7 criteria of the readiness, which I just go quickly. That the first is the country's e-commerce strategy. The second, ICT infrastructure and services. And the third, trade logistics and trade facilitation. Fourth, payment solutions. Fifth, legislation and regulatory framework. And sixth, skills development. And finally, 7th, access to finance. Now, also the e-trade readiness assessment has shown that these 7 criteria could be systematically proven if this policy and the political will is there. Now, improving readiness in such areas can help countries participate in cross-border exchanging goods and services through making the use of digital platforms. But there's a strange thing about it, because the trade negotiations on e-commerce is addressing the treatment of the data component. And that's because we already have the trade rules dealing with the trading goods and trading services, both at the multilateral and the regional level. Now, why are we talking about the data treatment in the negotiations on e-commerce? I think is because that it is the element in the trade that we still do not have a very clear framework of what we can do, what we cannot do, what can be beneficial, what can be harmful to countries, the welfare with respect to conducting the e-commerce. Now, from this perspective, I just would like to think a little bit about what could be the readiness of developing countries in terms of the treatment of data in e-commerce. The important readiness we seek, I think, is a country's capacity in management of the data value chain. And what do I mean with that? It's the commercial value of data. This commercial value of data actually emerges in the process of transformation of raw data into digital intelligence that can be monetized for commercial purposes. As we have heard through this e-commerce week, data is fast becoming a tradable commodity. And as the common saying goes, that the data can be the new oil. So value creation and capture, both raw data and capacity to process them into digital intelligence are needed. But there still is a huge capacity gap between developed economies and developing countries and among developing countries in terms of the management of the data value chains. So without this readiness, I would think many developing countries would feel uncomfortable in agreeing with common e-commerce rules on data treatment at the global level, because such a global rule could force them to remain as providers of raw data to global digital platforms while having to pay for the digital intelligence obtained from their own data. Having said that, the capacity gap can be much narrower within the regional framework, such as in the African Common Free Trade areas. And in such a circumstance, as we heard from the Secretary General of AFCFTA that you are building up this protocol of the digital trade. In such a circumstance, I think negotiating for a regional common rule on treatment of data in e-commerce can be a very useful track for upgrading with regional trade partners the ICT infrastructure, skills, and perhaps investment needed for establishing data value chains within the region and collectively managing the chains for their mutual benefit. Now, quickly for the second question on what are the key considerations that need to be addressed in common e-commerce regulatory framework. Having a regulatory framework is a means to achieve an end, which is to harness the surge in digital trade for the global goods for the sustainable development. In this context, we cannot treat data simply as a new money-making commodity. The data carry economic and non-economic values to our living. The treatment of data in e-commerce can have non-economic implications in terms of the privacy protection, human rights and security, and so on and so forth. Now, trade negotiations naturally focus on economic nature of data, but how to take into account of non-economic nature of data is, how can the trade negotiation encompass that just remains as a question. Hence, the key consideration would be, as the Deputy Secretary General mentioned in her speech, is to ensure that the trade negotiations on e-commerce are an integral element, an integral part of the global effort to harness data and digitalization for sustainable development, such as through this global digital cooperation scheme and also aiming towards the global summit in September, as the acting envoy said. Now, For this purpose, I think, and I conclude with this statement, that multilateral institutions such as UNCTAD can continue or shall continue to convene discussion and information exchange on synergistic linkages among various e-commerce negotiations and the global efforts for eliminating a digital divide, such as this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miho. I think it's very important to note some of the things. My key highlights away, also we're looking at investment capacity building, but I want to bring in Ambassador Tan, and for me, there is so much to learn from Singapore, which has been very active in e-commerce trade rule making. And obviously, when we are looking at, digging deeper to understanding some of the implications on what's at stake, also it's very good to draw from our experiences from countries like Singapore. What do you think would be the major benefits of harmonized e-commerce rules for developing countries? And just to add on that, what lessons can really be picked from the new generation RTAs and digital partnerships agreement?
Thank you very much, Maggie, for your thoughtful question. Let me begin by expressing my appreciation to UNTAC for inviting Singapore to participate in this session on e-commerce. Going back to your question, I think fundamentally, the ultimate goal of building national digital infrastructure must be to improve the lives and empower people, especially those in developing countries. It is about strengthening the resilience of our societies and economies. Thus, it's important for developing countries to participate actively in e-commerce rules making and to shape international norms. As we have heard, economic growth will increasingly be driven and enabled by automation and data exchange. The digital economy and e-commerce have become the new engines of growth. Globally, e-commerce sales hit US 25.6 trillion in 2018, and that is equivalent to about 30% of the global GDP. The COVID-19 pandemic has further accelerated the growth of e-commerce. Since the onset of the pandemic in 2020, e-commerce has moved hundreds of thousands of businesses online and prompted industries to transform their business models, including using online sales channels. In short, e-commerce has become a reality that is not only here to stay, but it will continue to grow and it will evolve rapidly. More importantly, the global community of stakeholders, including governments and businesses, must work together to harmonize rules and avoid regulatory fragmentation. In this context, let me make 3 points on how harmonized e-commerce rules could help developing countries embrace digital transformation and support digital capacity building. First, all countries, whether big or small, developed or developing, need global connectivity to leverage on each other's competitive advantage in order to realize the full potential of the global digital economy. Historically, global flow of goods and services have been transported by ships across oceans, by trucks over land, and cargo planes in the air. In the 21st century, global trade flows are increasingly conducted in bits and bytes. That means data flowing through fiber optic cables. Governments around the world have long realized this paradigm shift and have embarked on national efforts to restructure their economies to ensure that they are not left behind. Developing global e-commerce rules will complement national digital strategies, and together they help to facilitate the integration of countries into the global digital economy. Second, and this is worth emphasizing, harmonized rules will deliver the most benefits to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, MSMEs, and to women entrepreneurs. This is done by reducing cost, enhancing predictability, and expanding market reach. Harmonized rules will enable MSMEs and women entrepreneurs to overcome burdensome processes to account for different regulatory practices across different jurisdictions. And this enables them to tap into new opportunities in overseas markets. A good example would be harmonized rules to enable paperless trading. Given the often tedious documentary process, it can take many days to transfer and process trade documents and payments. In fact, currently, fewer than 1% of trade documents are fully digitized. Hence, a legal framework with updated rules on paperless trading could promote digitalization of trade documents and in turn, help facilitate the efficiency of trade processes. Third, harmonized rules are an important ingredient to facilitate the exchange of information across borders and ensure interoperability between platforms. For instance, in order for countries to seamlessly exchange electronic documents and data in a digital environment, all information must be clearly defined and unambiguous. Thus, reaching agreement on the rules, including definitions and data structure, is critical to ensure that countries and businesses have a common basis and understanding to trade with one another. It is for these reasons that Singapore has worked with other WTO members to support initiatives to address the challenges and seize the opportunities offered by digital transformation. The goal is to reduce trade barriers, including custom duty moratorium on electronic transmissions at the WTO. And this benefits especially MSMEs and women entrepreneurs. So together with Australia and Japan, Singapore are co-convenors of the JSI on e-commerce, which enjoys broad support of both developing, and even LDC members. I will just take one more minute to share a bit about Singapore's pursuit of the Digital Economy Agreements, which essentially aims to establish common frameworks and rules for digital trade that will enable companies to connect digitally across with their overseas partners more seamlessly. Through these DEAs, businesses can participate directly in digital initiatives in areas such as data protection and e-invoicing, and these help to support their cross-border business activities. In the course of negotiating these DEAs, Singapore has learned many lessons, including the importance of putting in place interoperable systems and providing legal assurance for the cross-border use of digital identities, electronic trade documents, and e-payment, among others. We look forward to working closely with our partners to expand our DEA network and to conclude the JSI on e-commerce so that together we can advance digital trade issues of mutual interest in an open and inclusive manner. Thank you.
Ambassador Chan, thank you very much. So much to draw from Singapore's strides that have been made, but also I think for me it's very important to note one of my key takeaways has been building digital infrastructure, especially for developing countries, which brings me to Africa, Miss Emily Mburu. Obviously, there is so much that is being done with the AfCFTA, but what is your expectation from the continental-wide harmonization of e-commerce regulations for Africa under this bloc? Also specifically for maximizing the benefits derived from data generated in Africa.
For this opportunity, for organizing this meeting. And then also, of course, I'm here to represent His Excellency Wamkele Mene, our Secretary General, and you've already heard of the vision that AfCFTA has as relates to digital trade. Maybe just to mention then, of course, the aim of having then a protocol on digital trade is to ensure that we have common rules common rules that will help us as a continent to then have a single digital trade market in the continent. And here, when we talk about digital, a single digital trade in goods and services market in the continent, we are talking about 55 countries actually coming together to create one single market in terms of digital trade. And of course, we are looking at it from the point of having a market that will generate substantial cost savings. And this is by generating economies of scale and making sure that there is investment in regional data centers that support online services in the continent. And this, of course, then includes cloud hosting and finding what is financially viable for the investors, even in the continent. And as you've heard from different speakers that have spoken earlier, and of course from His Excellency Wamkele Mene, one of the key elements that we are looking at is how do we ensure that Africans and innovators, especially from Africa, then benefit from the innovations that they undertake? And how do we have a protocol that will have a good balance between ensuring that we still have innovation in Africa, but then the regulations that enhance that trade within the continent? And of course, it has also been mentioned, the relationship between the work that we are going to undertake under the protocol on digital trade and the already established protocols in terms of goods and services, and the upcoming ones in terms of investment, intellectual property rights, competition policy, and all the other protocols that we hope to develop, especially in terms of inclusion, and this is women and youth in trade. So there is a lot of work that we are undertaking to ensure that the work that is done under digital trade will actually support all the other elements that we already have established when we talk about trading both goods and services. And I always avoid trying to talk about harmonization because harmonization is very difficult, but it is the idea to actually have common and coherent rules for this vast digital market and the digital economy at large. And such common or harmonized rules will then promote an open, transparent, and predictable digital trading environment, which will in turn create opportunities for inclusive trade and investment in Africa, and therefore further enhance the benefits of digital trade for businesses, consumers, and economies of Africa. And of course, as we have also mentioned, the issue of digitalizing customs procedures, making it easier then to move goods from one country to another. And here, of course, we do have examples in Africa where in the East African community, there has already been a lot of work that has been done in digitalizing customs procedures to make it easier for goods to travel between different ports, let's say the port of Dar es Salaam to Bujumbura in Burundi, or even from the ports of Mombasa to Kampala in Uganda. So there is already a lot of work that is already being done in Africa. And you did hear from His Excellency Wamkele Mene that we as the AFCFTA is also harnessing that experience from the Eastern side to see how do we make that a continental model. Then, of course, one of the other key elements that we hope to have from the protocol on digital trade is also to create a level playing field for business, and has also been mentioned by the ambassador from Singapore, to ensure that we have interoperability among systems and economies, which will then enable businesses and citizens to benefit from the digital economy. And also you did hear from different speakers earlier, the issue of ensuring that the common digital tools that are developed are then useful to implement the AFCFTA protocol, we have received a lot of interest from different players who are willing to help actually develop tools that will help us, say, implement the trading services protocol at the sectoral level and see how can our SMEs actually benefit from the implementation of the agreement. And we all know in Africa, there is vast differences in terms of the level of development. So how then do we ensure that no one is left behind? How do we have a balanced protocol that will make sure that SMEs from all over the continent, both formal and in the informal sectors, actually benefit from the protocol that we get? Another element, and has been mentioned also, is to ensure that we enhance the governance of data flows and promote digital trade and having an enabling environment in Africa by improving regulations on consumer protection, data protection, secure cross-border data transfers, and other relevant issues. We all talk about digital payments. You may have followed that now under the AFCFTA, we have what is called the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System that has been launched. And we have the pilot that has been done in what we call the ones areas of the West African side has shown that it is actually possible to actually have a payment system that uses the local currencies of the different African countries. And you're able to pay in real time and also reduce the cost of doing trade. And we also know about the M-Pesa example in Kenya, whereby there is now a digital payment system using the mobile system that is cross-border, actually in the East African community, that you can actually be able to pay for goods from Uganda to Rwanda to Kenya and all the other East African countries. So these are the kind of work that we hope will enhance intra-African trade in the near future, and of course is important for the implementation of the AFCFTA agreement. And therefore, just to say, by facilitating access to and the use of data across the continent, we hope that the protocol will then, of course, foster economic and social development, competitiveness and innovation, and also have enhanced and affordable access to data. We did hear about the fact that we don't want to just be the exporters of data, and then we have then to buy back the intelligence that is gotten from the data that we have exported. But we want to also be able to have data centers in the continent and to be able to analyze our data and come up with ways that will help our economies also to grow. And of course, then that will create more opportunities for our SMEs in the continent, and even make it easier for SMEs to actually be able to access financing, because for most SMEs, they are not able to actually put their financial data in order so that to be able to get more access to finance. So we have a number of tools that are being developed that will also help SMEs to go digital and also to use that data for their own benefit so as to get even easy access to financing. We also hope that this protocol will be useful for bringing on board underrepresented groups such as women, indigenous communities, and also persons with disabilities. These, of course, for most, as clearly stated in some of the earlier interventions, those are groups that are underrepresented. When you are able to have access to computers, to your phone, and to the internet, then you will be able to trade without leaving your home. We have all seen it during the pandemic. We have all continued with our meetings without leaving our homes. So how do we ensure that even SMEs can benefit commercially without necessarily also leaving their homes? So in this case, then, if we look at the absence of multilateral trade rules, then we hope that the protocol that we shall develop then will provide disciplines and practices that will eventually become the common position of African countries, even at the WTO. As we are all aware right now, there is no common position for most African countries, even at the WTO. And so we hope that once we have this protocol at the continental level, then it will provide the common position for even the African group when engaging at the WTO, and even in their own bilateral negotiations. We know that there are a number of agreements between African countries and trading partners that go beyond the traditional agreement and encompass elements of e-commerce. And so we hope that the protocol will then address some of the issues that then they need to address in the different chapters at the multilateral and even bilateral negotiations. We also need to recognize the strong synergies, as I've mentioned earlier, with the different other protocols that we are developing. And we hope to have, especially as I've mentioned, in the area of trading services, digital trade becomes quite pertinent. So how do we ensure that whatever we develop under the protocol on digital trade actually enhances trade and is not going hindrance to trade? So those are some of the issues that we hope to do and to clarify and strengthen these linkages to ensure coherency and predictability. I think just as I finished, then to say that we hope the instrument that we develop will bridge the double digital divide that is there even among African countries themselves and even with the global community. I'll stop there for now, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Emily. And before I let you go, I have to say that you said you wouldn't like to touch further on harmonization, but coming from East Africa myself in Rwanda, so many stories have been made in terms of this, and I'm a very big use of M-Pesa, and I've seen how this has actually made my life easier. I'm able to send money from Senegal to East Africa and all of that, but most importantly, I think for me, when you mention ensuring the governance of data flows is very important, and we're looking at a continent that is pushing the AfCFTA, the largest trading bloc since the World Trade Organization. Obviously, there is so much to really think of, but also as we move forward. We had a question from somebody, but I think you addressed it in your remarks, who was asking about the one common currency for Africa as a one single market regarding the AfCFTA implementation as a common currency. I think along the way we can have you address this further, but I want to bring in other speakers at this moment as we move towards the pathways through which e-commerce negotiations can address the need of developing countries in terms of data and digitalization for development. And at this point, I want to hear from Mr. Mehta to at least help us understand the global and regional trade negotiations targeting e-commerce and how international community can consolidate its efforts to better help developing countries benefit from the rulemaking in digital trade. Mr. Mehta, you have the floor.
Good morning to wherever you are. Very happy to be here, particularly in the whole week. I must compliment UNCTAD for having organized these events and raised the ante of something which is happening as a new thing. That moderator then leads me to remark that are we not rushing things? I mean, if you look at the history of trade as such, until the WTO came into being, trade in agriculture and trade in clothing was not in the GATT system. And until you develop that kind of understanding of maturity to delve into these areas, we continue to dabble here and there. And secondly, what is interesting and what is something worthy to be noted by UNCTAD, that this is no longer about e-commerce. We're looking at the whole digitalization, digitization, digital economy, etc., etc. And very rightly, Miro, you spoke about data. That's a major, major issue which is bothering many governments across the world. including Europe is passing new regulation, new laws. India is going to follow the same thing. So what I'm only trying to say is that it is still a very unclear field, and how we go ahead is very important. And even consumers who we represent are quite flummoxed. Their biggest problem today is something, we talk about globalization, but how do we redress the grievances across borders? It's still a big problem. I myself have suffered on a couple of occasions that if you have, my point is that these things should be kept in mind. Now, undoubtedly, e-commerce has the potential to accelerate the development of the world, I would say, especially what we've learned after pandemic, and as was stated by previous speakers. It accelerated the adoption of e-trade, as it were. Now, what we need to do is, what we also need to understand is, this is also being spoken about, is about 3 billion people in the world do not have access to internet. So you are looking at a huge digital divide, and even within countries. In my own country, India, which is quite huge, nearly 1/3 of the population have no access to internet. So what we need to develop common rules for e-commerce must be pro-developmental. It must make it very clear upfront that developmental issues are the most vital. Now, let me, 4 elements which will be the key to the development dimension in e-commerce foods. One is effective consumer protection. This is not only about privacy, which is again being debated, including here within UNCTAD's competition branch, the issue about privacy and competition in the context of digital space. The problem for consumers, what they see best is, how can they build trust in an emerging medium of trade? I can't go across to the supplier who's I can't see the face. I would rather go to the shop and have a chat about the weather, etc., buy my goods and come back, and including get credit for that, get goods on credit. This is a common phenomenon in most developing countries. Anyway, my only point was wanting to say that things are evolving so fast that they need to take into cognizance the fact that many things are still new. Now, how can you develop trust? By ensuring that consumer rights are identified and safeguarded in the digital marketplace. And as I said, one of the most critical elements of e-commerce is redressal or dispute settlement or what have you. However, we should go beyond this minimum threshold and research proactive solutions for consumer protection in e-commerce. Second, fair competition. Fair competition ensures that scarce resources are efficiently allocated and that the returns are widely distributed. It promotes productivity and innovation. Digital marketplace seems to be even more prone to anti-competitive practices than the physical, which is what we're seeing in many countries, including in India. What India has done, and this is I'm happy to tell the world at large, has adopted a very innovative method. They've launched a open network marketplace where any seller or buyer can go and need not go to a large company. So you have a neutral platform which will then help consumers to buy. And this is something which even developed countries should look at seriously in order to protect consumers. And Sweden itself has a very, very solid consumer policy in its governance. Now, Kutch has been a pioneer in the area of consumer rights and competition, including in e-commerce, and we'll be looking forward to sharing its knowledge and expertise in these areas. Third, policy space. And these are words which are maybe anathematical to some, but they're very crucial for developing world. And more so in an area where things are so unknown. You have to provide a policy space. And as Isabel also said in her opening remarks, that no one size fits all. Even within AFCFTA, Emily, I mean, we work on AFCFTA, as you might know, very closely. You pointed out kind of differential levels of development even within Africa is going to be a nightmare in order to get even minimum rules adopted, and even then somebody will not. So we require to keep that policy space in mind, and this is what I would even advise AFCFTA. So not to thrust down, one common set of rules, which may become a difficulty for a small country like Benin. Kenya may be more competent, but not necessarily all countries are equally competent. Sierra Leone, for example. Fourth, capacity building. The digital divide encompasses many dimensions: hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, knowledge and skills, and policies and strategies, to name a few. Developing countries and LDCs need substantial capacity building assistance in all these areas to benefit from the rules on e-commerce. And this is a message which I would like to also share with my Swedish friend, Barane. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mehta. Obviously, like you mentioned, notes, it's different context when it comes to different countries. But at this point, we've heard from our panelists, and I want to bring in an intervention from the floor from Mr. Paren Yerbon, who is the Director General for Trade, Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Sweden. He has a distinguished diplomatic career with postings in several countries, most recent as the Swedish ambassador to Brazil. Mr. Yerbon has also further served as the Swedish ambassador to Malaysia and as the head of the economic section of the Swedish embassy in Beijing. And I like how Mr. Mehta brings you into, make something clear to you. But from all the panelists and the opening remarks that we've had, what is your perspective on the topics so far for this session? Are we really missing out something?
I'd like to start by expressing my gratitude for the possibility to contribute to today's session, and to UNCTAD for hosting this session and the whole week. A great initiative which we really support. The Swedish government is convinced that the ongoing and rapid digital transformation opens up great opportunities for growth, for jobs, for sustainable development, and also, which was mentioned before, inclusiveness. I think that's key. The digital transformation, including e-commerce, can speed up the attainment of the sustainable development goals. But there are also challenges, let's be honest, and I'll come back to them. But basically, a very positive Swedish outlook is grounded in our own national experience in taking advantage of the digital technologies. In addition, a long-standing openness to global trade and to investment has promoted our digital transformation and our participation in global value chains. And Sweden is therefore a very strong supporter of ambitious EU trade agreements and the inclusion of commitments on digital trade. And we also, of course, welcome the global trend of concluding trade agreements with includes rules on e-commerce, also between the developing countries. And one particular example, of course, has been mentioned here before, and I'm happy to quote it again. It's the scheduled negotiations on a protocol to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. I think that's a wonderful example which we support. But we also, I think, we need modern and forward-looking trade rules concerning e-commerce on a global level as well. And we know they are lagging behind and there are challenges, but we need to tackle them. We support very much what was mentioned before by Ambassador Tan of Singapore, that the ongoing negotiations on e-commerce should be open, of course, to all WTO members. And I'm happy that both developing and LDCs are participating. I think they offer a unique opportunity to develop these global rules to fit them for the digital age. And we particularly, of course, welcome the participation of the developing countries. I won't go into details on the negotiations. It's difficult to comment on the broad range of issues, but they are, of course, of relevance to both developed and to developing countries. Some examples have been quoted before: the facilitation of e-commerce, e-signatures. My friend here from CUTS mentioned, of course, the consumer protection is an issue both in my country, Sweden, and in the developing countries. I have very much respect for that. We need, of course, to discuss improved access by local businesses, including SMEs and consumers, to affordable services and goods necessary for e-commerce. Growing overall competitiveness and participation of local businesses, we mentioned here before as well, in global value chain is also a key component. And I stress this, developmental perspectives are important, very important aspects of the negotiations. And this includes, of course, the traditional issue of special and differential treatment, but also the synergies with international development cooperation and aid for trade. But coming back to the challenges, digital trade creates considerable possibilities, but also challenges. There is still a digital divide between developed and developing countries, between men and women, but also perhaps between the younger and the bit older generation, to be honest. If we want to be successful to attack the global digital transformation, it must include everybody. And that was mentioned before, no one should be left behind. I think this should be the approach by us. And my government really believes that developmental cooperation can play a vital, important role in support and in a catalytical role, increasing the capacity of the developing countries to benefit from this transformation. And that's very key for us. Therefore, the Swedish aid for trade support is very significant, and it contributes to bridging this digital divide. The Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, who is probably familiar to many of you, is extending its support of relevance for e-commerce as a donor to the Enhanced Integration Framework, the ITC, and the World Bank. And in addition to that, the Swedish government, which I represent, has directed specific support for e-commerce to UNCTAD's program on e-commerce and digital economy. And we very much appreciate its broad range of activities concerning crucial aspects of the digital economy, not least through the E-Trade for Women initiative, representing a government who launched the first feminist foreign policy, I'm happy to say. But moreover, my government has also supported the cuts keeping pace with trade development initiative, where e-commerce is a very important component. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Helbon. I just want to bring in Emily back and Ms. Miho, and I don't know how we're going to do this, but I'd like a bit of your perspective on this. Obviously, we've had, in terms of development for Africa, but also the digital divide and inclusion. And Emily, we're looking at a continent that is over 1.2 billion people, but also we're looking at a bloc that is the largest since the World Trade Organization, and a huge informal sector, especially when it comes to e-commerce, which also poses a challenge of data, especially in terms of, collecting all of this data. And I understand you work with the East African community, which has really been successful in a lot of areas. For example, if you look at the One Area Network, among others. One thing I never heard for me, which I really think I would like to hear from, is where are we, and in terms of moving towards these negotiations? And for example, somebody watching from Africa, what would you tell them some of the strides we have taken in this particular area?
I guess you're taking me back to East Africa to try and talk about some of the
They had to do so,
And, definitely, there is a lot of work that has been done, and we know that there is a direct link, as I said, between services and digital trade. And the other day we had a meeting where we were looking at issues related to telecommunication services in Africa. And when you look at the issues of telecommunication, we've been talking about hard and soft infrastructure. All that is in the area of telecommunications and the negotiations that we are undertaking under trading services. So there is a lot of work that has been done. You have the One Area Network that was mentioned by Maggie. And in the One Area Network, the main thing is that the East African community has been able to actually remove roaming charges or significantly reduce roaming charges among the East African countries. So when you're in Uganda, you make a call to Rwanda, and it is just as if you're making a local call. So those are some of the advantages that have been done. Now, the next step has been to move that into the data, internet data area. And we hope that in the next few years, that should also be able to be liberalized or to actually eliminate that barrier when it comes to the East African community. And as I said, or let's say His Excellency Wamkelemene may have mentioned, is the fact that we work very closely with the regional economic communities, and they are the stepping stone, and we are gaining from the experiences that have been undertaken in the different tracks, and then seeing how do we use that experience at the continental level. So we hope that in the next few years, and as we discuss the protocol, then the protocol on digital trade in this case, then we will be learning also and taking the best practices from across the continent and the globe to make it more feasible. You did mention the issue of having a common currency in Africa. Of course, that is still work in progress, but we hope that the payment system that we have developed, the PAPS, will be able then to actually, at this juncture, enhance that trade. And if you pay in Naira and it can be able to convert the Naira into the Tanzanian shilling, then that already has provided a platform that will be useful to ensure that we can be able to trade in our different currencies, but in real time, and also making the different currencies convertible. So that creates already a form of level playing field. Now, when we talk about the different elements, the rights, and maybe here just to say that we hope that the legal commitments and the e-trade negotiations at the continental level will focus on development objectives. And I'm really happy to hear from the Ambassador of Sweden talking about the same issues, ensuring we have development perspectives in it, and to ensure that as we implement the protocol or develop the protocol, then it also helps us with industrial policies, digital industrial policies that will make it easier to develop the value chains, and then also to be able to then have the different supply chains in the continent better enhanced. And in so doing, then we narrow the digital and technological divide. And then, of course, there is the issue of digital rights. We've had a lot of it during the week, and Meta has mentioned it a lot in some of his interventions during the week. And so also issues related to infrastructural development. I think that is where we will need a lot of assistance, of course, in Africa, to ensure that we are able to develop both the hard and soft infrastructures, issues of connectivity, competition, and regulatory capacity. We have a number of African countries that are now coming up to consider issues of competition policy as relates to digital trade, and how is competition, especially, of course, at this juncture, it is still mostly the big players, the global big players that are in the different markets. And so how are we going to deal with issues of competition in terms of digital trade? So in a nutshell, I think those are some of the key elements that we are looking at and hope to address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. And obviously, I want to bring in Meho because as you were speaking, a couple of times I saw her agreeing to a lot of things and noting down a few of those that would definitely love to hear from. But you've mentioned, competition and all of that. And, one of the biggest, there's been a little bit of skepticism, especially when it comes to developing nations. And this is why we keep asking what's at stake for countries, the implications and all of this. Miho, is there an elephant in the room that we are not addressing at this, and what could it be?
Let me just say something. that the DSC has said at the very beginning in the opening speech that what is really important is really to have this outside the silo kind of approach for addressing e-commerce. And like Mr. Pradeep Betta said, it's not only about the e-commerce, it's about the digitalization. It's about the sustainable development altogether in face of the digitalization. And I just want to repeat what the DSG has mentioned already in her speech, that the UNCTAD Digital Economy Report 2021 actually talks about this, did the fact finding or the reality check about this situation, that number one, there is no universally agreed conceptualization of data, and we all agree on this point, right? Number two, cross-border data flow is difficult to measure, and there's no reliable official statistics to inform rulemaking efforts in terms of the types and etc. On this point, I just want to say that we talked about technical assistance, but I would like to talk about the international cooperation to help developing countries participate in dialogue and decision-making in this area, because any kind of the decisions or the mutually beneficial common rule in this area should have this development interest and development concerns in the center. Thank you very much. Let me close here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I just want to bring in Meta as we wind up or get closer to the end of the session. I mean, one of the comments we have in the section reads, there is an essential parameter to development of the creation of added value through digital technology, which is trading. Are there any recommendations for specific approaches in this area? Because the lack of high-level skills prevents LDCs from capitalizing on digital technology. Meta, as we get closer to the end of this conversation, I just want to hear your thoughts on this, but also, with the extensive work that you've done across different continents.
As I said earlier, the issue of the needs for capacity building must be viewed in the context of the current capacity constraints, which we have heard from all the speakers. And that's the biggest elephant in the room, if you ask me. The negotiations, the WTO negotiations on e-commerce, therefore, must address capacity building needs upfront instead of relegating it to the end. Because even for negotiations, Ambassador, the capacity doesn't exist. So that is very much. So it should not be, should not be just rhetoric, but or a sop, but to be taken up seriously. I mean, I consider capacity building for e-commerce as both a horizontal and a vertical issue. Hence, negotiations should have a distinct, dedicated track capacity building to address the horizontal aspects through broad provisions, somewhat like the TFA agreement has provided. I mean, it's a very good model which has been developed in the WTO, which we can import here as well. There should be substantive outcomes in capacity building. There should be a third-party measurement or on the capacity. Like UNCTAD has carried out e-trade readiness of 20-30 countries, and it has used skilled people from outside the system to help them to do it. But at the same time, what would also be necessary is that the capacity building work which is carried out should also be measurable in some manner or the other. And this is something which, Emily, can be done even at the ACFT level. This is a smaller world. I think that, as I've said, these work should be undertaken simultaneously on several parallel tracks. These will include support to expand connectivity in developing countries. You pointed out infrastructure is a major problem. Support to develop and implement national policies and strategies. Support to build required knowledge and skills, and support to effectively and constructively participate in e-commerce negotiations. Let me say a few more words on the final point. E-commerce negotiations are ongoing. We don't have luxury of time. Many developing countries and LDCs are unable to participate in these negotiations due to severe capacity constraints. providing them with demand-driven, need-based, robust, and neutral capacity-building assistance and negotiation is an absolute necessity. Kutch has been actively contributed, and thank you, the Ambassador Parane has also recognized the role which Sweden and Kutch are cooperating in order to build capacity, and we hope that we can increase these interventions in partnership with the various other organizations that are there, whether it is AFCFTA or ECA. I have been involved with ECA and AU as an expert on competition and investment, developing the protocols for the AFCFTA. So I said, I go back to a long time. Thank you very much.
I mean, Meta, before you actually go off, I know we're running out of time, but I am trying to understand what you meant by third-party measurement of capacity building. I mean, could you just elaborate a little bit in probably 30 seconds, if possible, what exactly you meant?
And do the measurement on a very neutral basis rather than on a pressure basis.
Less than 28
seconds. I took less than 28 seconds.
That's okay. I mean, I think we can continue this conversation online, but I want to bring in the ambassador from Singapore as we get some closing remarks from him. We have a comment that says, you know, the ambassador noted that all countries need global connectivity. Obviously, with the digital divide and the lack of internet access in many developing countries and LDCs, the JSI commerce consolidated negotiating context has not been made public. So have all developed countries in the JSI commerce agreed to binding and enforceable provisions providing affordable internet access to all developing countries and LDCs as part of the JSI commerce? I mean, it's a very long question, but I want to bring you in as you give us some closing remarks on this. Especially on some of the lessons also to draw. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie. Let me be very brief.
Yeah.
First, the JSI on e-commerce negotiations has the support and participation of a broad spectrum of WTO members, including many developing and even least developed members. Which really shows that developing countries can and should participate in the negotiations because, as I've said, it's important for developing countries to be at the table so that they can shape and influence the outcome. Second, we clearly recognize the importance of enhancing digital inclusion to bridge the digital divide. And there are ways and means whereby developing countries can access capacity building facilities. The Australia, Japan, and Singapore, we are currently trying to work out a program that could further enhance access to capacity building for developing members who are participating in the JSI on e-commerce. And my last word is that, look, digital transformation is a reality. It is here to stay. And it is imperative, therefore, for developing countries to be prepared to embrace it. Why? Because it is fundamentally about improving lives and empowering people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think for me, key points to take away is inclusion, capacity building, but also most importantly, building digital infrastructure, especially for developing countries. I think most of the questions that came through are addressing these, and from all the speakers that we've had, the future seems to be bright, but there's absolutely no right time to discuss this than now, looking at what we have learned for the past 2 years from the coronavirus pandemic. The world is going digital. I mean, look at us having this discussion from wherever we are joining from. It shows us what the future looks like, but also there are a lot of things at stake. most importantly, we're excited to hear about, what the implications could be, but also, what the benefits at the core point of this could be for sustainable development, especially for least developed countries globally. I want to thank our panelists today, His Excellency Mr. Tan Ho Seng, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Singapore to the WTO and WIPO. Thank you so much for joining us today and for making time on this Friday. And Ms. Miho Shirotori, the Acting Director Division on International Trade and Commodities on UNCTAD, thank you so much for being with us today. Ms. Emily Mburundoria, the Director of Trade in Services, Investment, Intellectual Property Rights and Digital Trade, FCFTA Secretariat, thanks a lot. I am a big believer in the East African community, but most importantly, the FCFTA, and the potential is enormous, and it's very good to hear, what is already being done by the FCFTA. And Mr. Pradeep Mehta, the Secretary General of CUTS, Consumer Unit and Trust Society International. And of course, we had an intervention from one of the speakers, Mr. Per-An Yelborn, who is the Director General for Trade at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs for Sweden. So much has been discussed, but obviously we're running out of time. Nevertheless, the conversation never ends here. We still have questions coming in on our social media pages, on Twitter, on Facebook, on UNCTAD. Just send through your thoughts and, some of the questions you might still have, and the panelists might be able to answer directly, I suppose. That brings us to the end of the conversation, closing it at the right time. Thank you so much for being a part of this, and I wish you a very wonderful weekend from wherever you're joining us from. Thank you. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon.